Hello and welcome to the Quantum tutorials. This is Professor Quantum speaking. Thank you very much for joining us in this class. In this class, we're going to be looking at genetics, a topic that many people fail to understand, but it's very, very simple in reality. So I would encourage everyone who is watching our videos to have a book and a paper, book and a pen where to write from, so that everything that they are writing down, they can be able to remember them. I would encourage everyone on whichever platform that they're watching us from to follow, to like, to subscribe, to download our videos if you like them and share them with your friends. Shall we begin? What is genetics? Now, I want to build an understanding of genetics based on how we understand the cell. I want to build this genetics based on how we understand the cell and how we understand ourselves. So, given that there is something called a talent, right? There's something called a talent, right? This talent is something that we know that we do very well at, something that we do very well at. You understand? So, if you have a talent, then it is something that you do very well at, something that you do very well at. Where do we get these talents from? Where do we get these talents from? We have to understand to say these talents are not just something that come about, but these are things that we inherit. You understand? So the best question that I can always pose to each and every people of mine is, don't you ever wonder that there are some situations where you do something very similar to your parents, very similar to your father, very similar to your mother, let's say how you write, maybe your handwriting there, how you speak, your voice there. We can also talk about um the facial comparisons, how someone looks. They may be looking very much similar to their dads and very much similar to their moms. In short, it's mostly like a combination of the two. Now, where does that come from? That comes from what is known as what an inheritance. In inheritance, inheritance, an inheritance. When you look at an inheritance in biology, you don't just talk about something that is passed on from someone, but we even specify to say that these are characteristics, characteristics passed on from generation, from generation to generation, between parents and their offspring. Between parents and their offspring. So this inheritance helps our offspring to be able to do what? To gain from us what we have. You see, in order for our offspring to gain from us what we have, there is what is known as what? An inheritance. You understand? This inheritance, these are characteristics that we pass on to our offspring. Now, all this is wrapped on in what is known as what? Genetics. Genetics from genetics. From genetics there, which is the study of mechanisms. This genetics is the study of mechanisms. The study of mechanisms mechanisms involved mechanisms involved in the control, transmission, transmission, in the control, transmission, and the expression of characteristics, in the expression of what? Of characteristics. That is what genetics is. Genetics is the study of mechanisms involved in the control, transmission, and expression of characteristics. Now, What are these characteristics? A characteristic, a characteristic. I hope you are noting this down because these notes are very simplified. They're very simplified and easy to understand. What is this characteristic? A characteristic. This is something. This is something that distinguishes. This is something that distinguishes us. This is something that distinguishes us from others. This is something that distinguishes us from others. This is something that distinguishes us from others. Now, from these characteristics, you have to be able to understand. You have to be able to understand that it is something. This is something that distinguishes us from the others. It is something that distinguishes us from the others. Now, speaking of others, others may be, let's say, a characteristic is something that distinguishes us from others. When you talk about characteristics, for example, when you talk about characteristics, for example, we can talk about your skin color. You can talk about skin color. You can talk about your skin color. You can talk about the hair color. You can talk about the height. Height. You can talk about the body mass, not body mass, but body mass rather. Everything is something. These are characteristics. These are characteristics. These are characteristics. They are characteristics that we have, which means that they set us apart as humans from one another. It is very, very rare that as an individual we have what the same characteristics. How are we going to be able to what to differ from something else? Even twins, they have different characteristics. You might find that someone is taller than the other, even if they are of the same characteristics. You might find that even if they are of the same height, even if they might be of the same facial color, you might find that they have different characteristics within them. You might find that their height might be a bit different. You might find that their tone, skin color might be different. You might find that their voices might be different. You might find that their eye colors might be different. And there's one fun fact: even if most characteristics might be the same, twins will never have palms that have the same. The palm pattern will always be different from each twin because that is just something that will always be different from the other. We continue. We continue. So this aspect of genetics that we have to understand, we have an aspect of variation. We have an aspect of variation there. We have an aspect of variation. We have an aspect of variation. What is this variation? Variation refers to the differences in what in a characteristic. This is the differences in characteristics. Differences in what in characteristics and has and has many and has many or rather two types and has many or rather two types and has many or rather two types, namely continuous variation, and discontinuous and discontinuous variation, discontinuous variation and discontinuous variation. Pardon me, yeah? And discontinuous variation. It's just very few but important things that you have to understand about variation. From the way to vary, from the way to vary. To vary, this is just simply to what it is. Right. To vary, this is just simply to what to differ. To differ. Things that set someone apart. You understand? A word that is mostly used in our day to day life. But what does it really mean? When you talk about variation, you're just talking about things that make someone different from the other. You see? Now we go back to our definition of characteristics. So when you talk about variation in biology, this is a term that is used as in differences in characteristics, differences in what? In characteristics, differences in characteristics. So differences in characteristics, differences in what? In characteristics. When you talk about variation, then you're just talking about differences in what? In characteristics between individuals. Differences in characteristics between individuals. Vary. Differences in characteristics. Things that make someone to actually really set them apart. So non-discontinuous variation. So let me start with continuous variation. Let me start with continuous variation. Let me start with continuous variation. What is this continuous variation? So when you talk about continuous variation, it is a type of variation. This is a type of variation. It's a type of variation which has a type of variation which has a type of variation which has characteristics 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 with many intermediate forms with many intermediate forms. What does this mean? What does this mean? When you talk about many intermediate forms, what does it mean? It means to say from the characteristics that you can have, let's say characteristic of height there. Let's say characteristic of height as our first example. It means that in this characteristic of height, there are many forms of height that make people what? Different. Many forms of height that make people different. And some are what? The following. We all know that we all know that someone can either be what? Tall or what? Or short. Someone can either be tall or short. But in between tall or short, there exists what? Two different intermediates in between. There exists different forms of tall and what? And short rather there. You can go into say someone can either be, let's say, 6 foot tall, someone can either be 5'2", someone can either be, it depends the type of what of characteristics that they have. But we all know to say there is no specific way to which you can say to say, okay, this is the type of toe that's supposed to be toe. But rather there are different forms to which someone can what, there are different heights to which someone can what, can be tall, and someone to which someone can be classified as being tall. That is known as a continuous variation. The variation continues. It doesn't just end on two intermediate. It doesn't just end on what, on two intermediates. The best example that are there examples include examples. We have heights, we have complexion, we have complexion, and then we have body mass there. And then we have what? Body mass. So when you talk about height, height has already been discussed. But complexion, we are dealing with something like complexion. Complexion, this is just simply the color tone of their what? Of their skin. Let me use another color ink because the black one seems to have lost some ink there. I'm going for blue. So when you talk about complexion, someone can either be light, very light, dark. We also have people that are very dark. We also have people that are very dark. We also have people that are very dark. Dark, and you will have a very dark. So how does this work? If you look at someone who is dark and who is light, you begin to see someone might be dark, someone might be very dark, someone might be medium, someone might be colored and all that. Someone might just be light, very light, and someone might just be in between. So this type of continuing variation, whereby you know, it doesn't just end on someone just being light and dark. No, but it is what doesn't just end on someone being light and dark, but rather it ends on the fact that there are many forms to the skeleton of an individual. The other one is the body mass. When you're dealing with body mass there, body mass, the mass of an individual differs. Here, people can weigh, people can weigh, let's say 55 kg, but you also find someone who has, let's say, 50. Let's say you have someone who is 70. Some people go up to 110 there, and the number just keeps on what on increasing, and you can also decrease the numbers. Likewise, there are people who have a mass of 10. There are people who have a mass of 10. There are people who have a mass of what? Of 10. There are people who can also, there are people, let's say, these might be babies there, these might be babies, these might be babies. So you have babies. Babies can have a mass of 10 kg there, and it can go lower 5 kg there, but 5 kg baby, I'm trying to see someone who is very, very weightless and has very little mass there. So for continuing, we have a curve that distinguishes the curve that shows how what how this continuous variation works. And this type of a curve is usually asked in the paper one of biology there, and you have to be able to know this curve very, very well so that you can be able to answer this specific type of questions. Now, before we what we go forward, so we have to understand to say a normal distribution curve, a normal distribution curve, a normal distribution, a normal distribution what? A normal distribution curve, a normal distribution curve or a bell shaped or a bell shaped is usually produced. Is usually what produced because it shows different intermediates to which characteristics can exist. Let me put it here with much space so that we can easily see it. We have a normal distribution curve, a distribution curve there, a distribution curve goes like this. It is some sort of a parabola. Here you have number of categories, number of categories, or rather number of organisms, number of organisms, and then you have characteristics in their intermediate. Then you have characteristics in their intermediate form. Their intermediate form. So, I'll go on this smaller one. For example, if you have number of categories, if you have let's say 10 here, you have 9 there, then you have 8 there, you have 7 and so on and so forth. And then here you can have categories. Let's say you have short. No, let me go for body mass. Let me go for body mass. I'll say body mass there. This curve talks about body mass. The axis talks about body mass. We can say to say 6 people here. 6 people on this curve are weighing 45 kilograms. And then you can say 7 people in a group of 10. 7 people in a group of 10. 7 people have what? They weigh 60 kilograms. You have 8 there that have, let's say, 65 and so on. So when you look at this distribution curve shows differences in what? In categories. You understand? Differences in categories that go back to the whole definition of what? Of continuous variation. The whole definition of continuous continuous variation, which means to say there are a lot of forms a characteristic that it can what? It can portray. Here we have weight, but the body mass of someone takes on what? On changing. Someone might be 45, in another group they might be what is 60, they might be 65, and so on and so forth. You get to see to say it is showing different forms of intermediate depending on the type of what category. Then we also have another type of what of variation, which is known as the discontinuous variation. Speaking of discontinuous variation, discontinuous discontinuous variation for discontinuous variation. So for discontinuous variation, you see to say it's a type of variation. It's a type of variation that does not that doesn't have intermediate forms. That doesn't have intermediate forms between characteristics. Between what characteristics there. This is what non-discontinuous, non-discontinuous rather, non non-discontinuous variation. Non-discontinuous variation. Non-discontinuous continuous non-discontinuous variation. Non-discontinuous variation. If you talk about non-discontinuous variation, you begin to understand to say we have examples such as we have examples such as we have examples such as what? Eye color, eye color. We have blood groups. We have blood groups there, and then you can also have blood groups. You can also have you also have things like